Let me ask you about Ukraine. Just a question or two. Sometimes I laugh because it is now not just common, but essentially obligatory in European capitals, in the Western press, to admit what for so long was prohibited to say, which is that Ukraine has no chance to win the war against Russia because simply on size grounds alone, the Ukrainians can never find the people necessary to fight against the Russian army. Eventually, Russia will win. Ukraine will have to concede territory as part of the solution that everybody knows is coming. This is something that you've been saying for as long as I've been talking to you about this war, that got you put on all sorts of lists as a Russian propagandist and the like, and now suddenly it becomes consensus. That happens over and over. What becomes taboo becomes consensus, and nobody ever admits that transformation. But there seems to be finally a recognition, except among a few crazy extremists in Europe, that this war has to come to a negotiated end, that the Russians are going to end up with some kind of a territory. How do you see this negotiation with Trump now in the picture proceeding, and do you have hope that there will be an agreement sooner rather than later?
Well, the question, Glenn, that we really care about is whether you can get a negotiated agreement that leads to a meaningful peace agreement, or are you going to end up with a frozen conflict, an armistice, where the fighting stops and there's an agreement not to start it up, but there's no meaningful peace agreement. The question is, what are you going to get? In my opinion, and I hope that I'm wrong here, you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. And you're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement because I think it's impossible for Trump to accept the two basic conditions that Putin insists on. One is Putin says the West and Ukraine both have to recognize the annexation not only of Crimea, but of the 4 eastern oblasts that the Russians have now annexed. So we have to recognize that as a permanent feature of international politics. And second, we have to agree that Ukraine will never be in NATO. It will be a genuinely neutral country. So it can't even be a de facto member of NATO, which is what it has been in recent years. I think it's almost impossible for Trump to accept those two conditions. And if he were to accept those two conditions, which the Russians insist on, then he would face Trump would face a tremendous backlash in the West, especially in the United States, but also a tremendous backlash in Ukraine.
And in his own party.
Absolutely. But this is the deal that the Russians insist on. You want to remember, Glenn, that you have to think about what caused this war to think smartly about how to end it. And there are two views as to what caused the war. One is the view that you and I share, which is that NATO expansion into Ukraine was the principal cause. The other view is that Putin is an imperialist who is bent on creating a greater Russia and then conquering territory in Eastern Europe and maybe even in Western Europe. He's an imperialist. Well, if you believe that he's an imperialist, he's just interested in conquering territory, you can work out a bargain with him, right? Because there's always room for him to recognize that he can't conquer any more territory. He's got quite a bit, and just settle with the territory you've conquered. That's consistent with the argument that this war was an imperial war. If you believe that this war was all about NATO and that Ukraine and NATO was an existential threat that had to be dealt with, then the only way you can settle the war is by agreeing to the fact that Ukraine will never become part of NATO. And we are, up to this point, incapable of acknowledging that line of argument. We just say Ukraine will be part of NATO. And as long as we insist that Ukraine will become part of NATO, the Russians are going to continue to push forward. They have no choice because they believe that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. The problem we face in the West is hardly anybody believes that Ukraine and NATO was the cause of this war. Therefore, they think we don't have to acknowledge that to settle this, we have to declare that Ukraine will be a neutral state. And as long as we don't accept Ukrainian neutrality, there's no way to shut this one down, short of a frozen conflict.
The West in general is incapable, I think, of believing that it contributes in any way to the start and outbreak of wars, that it's always just the West who's the innocent victim, and the whatever country we happen to be against has turned psychotic or aggressive, and we're there to protect the world from decent things. And it's a very ingrained propagandistic belief that I think is very difficult to overcome in any specific case. And here in particular, the propaganda was so relentless and intense about the start of the war, about why it happened, that I think you're right. It's almost impossible to ever uproot that. And therefore, an agreement that requires that does seem unlikely. But the question then is, there does seem to be a loss of will, not just in the West, but also now in Ukraine. Zelensky seems to want to deal as well. So if you're saying that it's unlikely for the reasons you laid out, that I agree with, that a permanent peace, a real peace deal is impossible, is there something short of that that will freeze hostilities, but isn't really a real peace deal that you expect or think is possible?
No, you're not going to get a real peace deal. You'll get a frozen conflict. At some point, the Ukrainians will not be able to continue the fight. The Russian steamroller will have conquered enough territory. Ukraine will be so weak, will have lost so many people, that you'll get a frozen conflict. The problem with the frozen conflict is that it may heat up again. And you can imagine all sorts of scenarios where it will heat up. As I like to emphasize, it's important to note that once you get a frozen conflict, the Ukrainians will do everything they can to undermine Russia's position in the areas of Ukraine that it controls. The West, especially the United States, will do everything it can to undermine Russia. And the Russians, for their part, will do everything they can to interfere in Ukrainian politics and maintain Ukraine as a dysfunctional rump state. The Russians will go to great lengths to sow trouble in Europe among the various NATO countries. The Russians will go to great lengths to undermine transatlantic relations. So you're going to have poisonous relations between Russia on one hand and Ukraine and the West on the other hand for as far as the eye can see. This is what happens if you get a frozen conflict. If you were to get a genuine peace agreement, this would not be the case. But as I was saying, I do not see how you get a genuine peace agreement, because it would require Ukraine and the West to recognize Russian conquests up to now, number one, and number two, agree to a neutral Ukraine. And I don't see that happening. And absent that happening, you're going to have a frozen conflict with poisonous relations between the two sides. And Glenn, if I could take this a step further, you want to understand that superimposed on that frozen conflict in Ukraine are 6 flashpoints in Eastern Europe that could blow up in our face. 1 is the Arctic, 2 is the Baltic, 3 is Belarus, 4 is Kaliningrad, 5 is Moldova, and 6 is the Black Sea. These are all potential flashpoints for trouble between the West and the United States, and between the West and Russia. And we should be worried about that greatly, because those flashpoints will exist in this poisonous political environment.
Well, Western elites seem very unworried about escalatory risks, and from the beginning, that has been shocking and evident at the same time. In times like these, uncertainty is the only certainty, from geopolitical risks like the ones we've seen in the Middle East and Ukraine, both of which risk destabilizing global markets. To the Fed's nonstop money printing, it's hard to feel secure about your financial future. Since 2020, the US dollar has lost 24% of its buying power, and with inflation rising and government debt ballooning, your hard-earned savings are at risk. That's why I trust Lear Capital to help me understand the benefits of gold and silver that are physical assets that hold their value in turbulent times. Lear has educated me and many others on how to diversify into gold that can give you control over your financial security. With their helpful guides, you can understand how to take possession of various high-value metals, store them safely, or roll over your IRA and 401k tax and penalty-free. It's easy to get started. Just call Lear Capital today at 800-920-8388 or visit LearGreenwald.com for your free wealth protection guide. They've got loads of reports to help you understand the current political and economic landscape that I really do recommend. And here's a special offer for my viewers. You get a $500 credit toward delivery, storage, or IRA fees with your qualifying purchase. Learn how you can protect your future. Call Lear today at 800-920-8388. That's 800-920-8388 or go to LearGreenwald.com. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.